Hi everyone, welcome to Wandering DMs. I'm Paul.
And I'm Dan, and on this episode of Wandering DMs, we're going to be talking about, it's been 50 years since Gygax and Perrin's Chainmail miniatures game was first published. So we thought we ought to take an opportunity of that. You know, I still look at this every single day practically for my D&D gaming and my miniature war gaming. And I guess of course I do. And sometimes I overlook the fact that that's not super common anymore.
Yeah.
So we figured we'd take the opportunity to celebrate Chainmail, which is kind of the root of our fantasy hobby game, and talk about what parts of it do we still look at today, or what parts should we have abandoned a long time ago. And we might have possibly different opinions about that.
So Dan, have you ever just sat down and played a straight game of Chainmail?
That's among the best questions that anybody could possibly ask, Paul, and the answer is absolutely not.
Why is that?
I have actually never played a straight game of Chainmail. Okay, so I'm interested in the fantasy stuff.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I'm interested in D&D. I'm interested in wizards and dragons and giants and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And Chainmail doesn't handle that in conjunction with mass combat. And that's actually a point of confusion that we could get into more later on. But the so obviously Chainmail, which was published either March or April of 1971, I see a couple different months exactly, has three dominant parts. Number one, it's got the big mass combat, how do you deal with medieval armies section. Doesn't have any dragons or wizards or stuff like that. Right. And then you have the man-to-man combat section, where you can have individual figures battling with a slightly different rule set. And then right at the back, there's this appendix called the Fantasy Supplement, and that's where the wizards and the dragons and the hobbits and the dwarves and the elves are. But that's only at man-to-man scale. So if I want to have a fight with, you know, a single fighter versus a single ogre, I might as well use D&D for that. Mm-hmm. And if I want to have an army combat between a bunch of elves and a bunch of ghouls, Chainmail doesn't handle that, actually. You got to use a different rule set. So I look at it a lot for the DNA of bits and pieces that came into our 1-to-1 scale D&D game, and I look at it a lot for stuff that went into later mass combat games like Swords and Spells or Battle System or even Warhammer. But if I want to run armies with fantasy units, Chainmail actually doesn't handle that. So I wind up, you know, looking at it as a source, but using some other rule set for that.
Now I know at GaryCon these days, somebody usually runs a big Chainmail game, right? Like I think that's a thing that I would expect to see at GaryCon. So are they just playing? Do you think they're just playing like straight up medieval warfare?
I think, okay, so, and I think that the big, if I recall correctly, the big Chainmail table is run by Paul Stormberg, I think.
Okay.
On an annual basis, if I'm not incorrect by that. And Paul does, you know, wonderful historical work, and he recently made a big video about the history of Chainmail. It's on YouTube that I would recommend to people if you don't know what it is. If you do know what it is, then you probably already know what's in there. And my understanding is that Paul disagrees, actually, with the observation that I just made. There's a lot of people that kind of hand wave the whole scale issue. Mm-hmm. And I've seen people say, I just don't care. I don't care what the reputed scale is. I'm going to throw ogres and wizards and heroes into my Chainmail game. And I think Paul plays kind of fast and loose on that issue. So I think he actually... he actually does throw heroes and wizards and priests and ogres into those games, and kind of overlooks the weird scaling issues that you get as a result.
Interesting.
I did not man to come right out of the box and just slam Mr. Stormberg. That was not the intent.
I feel like we should get him on the show, and we should have a little debate here.
That's a good question. And I've had, you know, part of the things on the scaling issue that people do get confused is that, you know, is that Chainmail is mostly mass scale, and then the fantasy stuff is all at 1-to-1 scale. Gygax was very, very consistent on that issue over the years. And there's a lot of things that Gygax was inconsistent about. He was very consistent about the fantasy scale there was 1-to-1. And he said that in original D&D, and he said it in Swords and Spells, and he said it in an interview in 2005. I do know that some people actually point to Gary having been at one of those Gen Con chainmail games, and their main piece of evidence for the opposite is that he didn't dispute that the scale was at mass scale when someone else ran it. And I've seen people hang their hat on that argument, and for me, that's fairly weak evidence. Gary was a charismatic guy, right? We know that he liked to walk into a room and brighten it and make people feel good about themselves. And I really feel like Gary's charisma was much higher than for him to walk up on a table and shit all over somebody's chainmail miniatures game and say, "You're doing it all wrong. This sucks. Get out of here, kids." I think we all know that Gary wouldn't do that.
He saved that for his writing.
Interesting. I didn't know. It's interesting that you've got. That's interesting that that is one of the main. The scaling issue is one of the main things that I think about with chainmail, and so I think about that very, very carefully. And there's a lot of other people that like to wave their hands and say, we just didn't care about it and we had fun with it, so who cares? Mm-hmm. But when you do try to interface a D&D game with it, there's a big difference. And of course, the main difference is that if chainmail is at 1-to-20 scale, then it makes the difference of does your fourth level hero, are they attacking 4 men per round, or are they attacking 80 men per round? And that's a huge difference. If you're playing D&D, classic D&D, and you can get maybe 4 attacks per round, and then you just declare, now I'm fighting an army, so I can attack 80 men per round. And Gygax was very consistent. He said, absolutely not. It is 4 men, the end. It's 4 men. It's not 80 men. Right. But there are other people that say, you know what? I love being able to attack 80 men. I love being able to get 80 attacks per round. Please don't take that away from me. That's how we played it, and that's how I want it. And we can sort of understand if that was a feature that they got out of it, why they want to hang on to that. Sure.
Now, I mean, the interesting thing is, right, that we generally talk about chainmail. We're always looking at it sort of through this lens of, through D&D, right? Clearly, D&D was built on top of chainmail. But surely there was a period of time where chainmail was just chainmail, right? Chainmail was just its own thing. D&D didn't exist yet. I'm curious.
Yeah, absolutely.
Was it highly popular? Do you know? Was it better than other war games out at the time?
Well, that's interesting. I think that the thing that took off was the fantasy supplement.
The fantasy supplement.
And, and of course they had, the chainmail publication. Some of those rules were in some prior newsletters that Jeff Perren in particular was working on. Mm-hmm. So the germ of the mass combat rules was in the Castle and Crusades newsletter, to my understanding, around 1970, 1971. And the Domesday Book newsletter, issue number 5, I guess had some pieces. But the new thing in the published product was that fantasy supplement section. Right. And I think in later years, Gary would say that was the tail that wound up wagging the dog.
Right.
That's really what got all the attention.
Right.
And to my understanding, there was some pushback in the community. There were some people that really were really offended at getting ridiculous crap like hobbits and sprites and goblins and dwarves into your very serious Napoleonic medieval simulation game. Right. And you know what? The funny thing is, I gotta kind of sympathize, because honestly, I'm of a mindset that I look at some stuff in D&D today, and it could be tieflings or cat people or all kinds of anthropomorphic animal races and stuff like that. And I'm like, that's a little too far. You got to rein it in, kids. Rein it in.
Yeah.
And in that respect, I can actually sympathize with people, actually disputing having this fantasy supplement in there. But to my understanding, that was largely the first supplement that allowed you to game fantasy dragons and wizards and ogres and stuff like that, and that caught people's imagination, and rightfully so.
Yep. Interesting.
Ash has a question there, about 3 back, I think, of, is there any evidence that Gygax disputed how anyone ran any games that he has author credit for?
Is there?
I think the answer is yes, right? I've never heard about it in person. I've never heard about it from walking up to someone's face, but I think in the early zine days, there is quite a lot of him being very critical, particularly of fanzines published outside TSR. So there was one, Alarms and Excursions, published by Lee Gold in California, I think, where he was pretty highly critical about some of the stuff that was put in there, I think.
Was that just him?
So in writing,
but copyrights or defending ideas, or is that?
I think that was part of it. I think that was part of it. That was the kind of the era where all that stuff was sort of getting worked out for the first time, and I think there was an element of control that he wasn't fond of. There was an element of going too far that he wasn't fond of, and then it was sort of wrapped up in copyright trademark issues. Now, on the other end of it, I think it was a very famous quote in one of those Alarms and Excursions where somebody said, "Dungeons and Dragons is too important to be left to Gary Gygax alone."
That's great.
And that's a pretty strong argument.
Yeah, for sure. Fascinating. So I guess just to like, I'm sure everyone who's watching this show knows, right, that like Chainmail's war game had fantasy supplement. D&D, original D&D, references it extensively, right? Like there's no rules in the Little Brown books for a lot of the stuff. It just says see Chainmail. And then we lose that link, immediately, I think, right? What's the next, first edition AD&D or Holmes Basic? They're immediately just not referencing Chainmail, I think, right?
Pretty close. I think Holmes does in 1 or 2 places, actually. Okay. I think so it might be just one single place. Name, and I'll tell you where it is. In Chainmail in the supplement, right? They borrow a lot of mechanics from the mass combat section. Even though it's a different scale, they say just go ahead and use those rules. For example, giants throwing boulders says just go use the catapult rules. That's it. So you can save a lot of text because there's all of literally three words to describe giants throwing boulders, namely as heavy catapults, I think.
Gotcha.
And I think Holmes actually still copy-pasted that and said, here's how giants can throw boulders, and this comes out of Chainmail. Okay. But I think that might be about it, actually.
Interesting.
Other than that, totally agree. I don't think, I'm pretty sure first edition doesn't reference Chainmail at all. I don't think. Yeah. So you're right, it goes away pretty fast.
Yeah, it goes away. And then fascinatingly, we see product after product where we try to reintroduce mass combat into D&D.
Yeah.
Right? Even though it was birthed from mass combat, which is fascinating.
That's a great point. Yeah. And again, the thing that was missing in Chainmail was specifically interfacing fantasy stuff with your mass combat. And so let me grab it here. So still in the original D&D era, the very last supplement actually was the Swords and Spells supplement.
Yep.
Which actually is, right here, is allowing you to use fantasy units in an army situation. That was why what you just said, Paul, that's why this got published. It's entirely the modus operandi of this little book here. And there's an advertisement in Dragon Magazine number 5 where it specifically says that now you can use both heroes and wizards with armies at the same time! ! That's actually what the ad says. Yeah. And the very first paragraph of the introduction hammers that again, and that's and you're totally right. So the need to interface fantasy stuff with mass combat is really what spawned Swords and Spells and Battle System and a bunch of stuff that came out.
And so with Swords and Spells, right? Because that's the most fascinating thing to me about Swords and Spells is it's still part of that line of original expansions to OD&D, which is in turn referencing Chainmail. So why do we need it? Is it just trying to solve that scale problem?
It's totally just trying to solve that scale problem.
Interesting.
I would say. Yeah, the movement is pretty darn similar. The formation rules are pretty much just copied out of Chainmail. The terrain rules are pretty much just copied out of Chainmail. It has a totally different mechanic for determining attacks and damage, and that mechanic is terrible. So,
oh dear,
it's among the worst. When we had Jonathan Tweed on a couple of weeks back, he nodded to that when I said the same thing.
Yeah,
that it's among the most baffling combat mechanics ever written down. So clearly that wasn't the motivation.
Right.
The motivation was entirely just we got to be able to work your heroes into army situations.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah, which is really interesting, I think, for us in particular, Dan. It's an itch that you and I have tried to scratch many times. And obviously, you end up writing a whole rule set yourself to handle it.
Yes.
And I've incorporated that into my campaigns in the past, and had you show up as guest opponent, if you recall, back in the day. So we know that it works pretty well.
Let me tell you, I mean, my favorite thing in the world is to play adversary in a mass miniature army situation. I mean, sure, just give me everything that I've ever wanted.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Oh dear.
Yeah. Now, interestingly, so if you're watching this later in the YouTube archive, I hope that you'll take a look at the live chat, because we currently basically have the debate playing out in the live chat right now between exactly how that interfaces. And I'll just throw out another complication on the scaling issues. The problem is, even though the fantasy supplement technically works at 1-to-1 scale, again, they just borrow the mechanics from the mass combat scales to do your attacks. So you can totally see why there's a lot of confusion between now we're at 1-to-1 scale, but go ahead and use the mass combat attack matrix for most of the stuff, but then go to this other matrix for other stuff, and it's possibly hard to interpret.
Fascinating. Do we have any first-hand records of actual games being run back in the day which incorporated mass combat through one of these systems? Is this a thing that Gygax featured in his own games?
That's a great question, and it's the opportunity is obviously built very much into original D&D and still through first edition. The opportunity to get a high-level character, build a castle, found a barony, hire an army, fight other baronies. That's kind of the whole end game of the whole project.
Right.
And sometimes I personally feel like that it didn't quite pay off on that, actually. I haven't heard a lot of case studies of that back in the day, and I've seen a quote from Gygax that said, "Nah, my players weren't really interested in that."
Right.
That stopped happening.
The anecdote I'm always reminded of is the first Brownstein game. Run by, I'm going to say his last name wrong now because you corrected me on it last time, David Wesley.
I think my understanding is that's correct. Okay. Dave, feel free to correct us again if you didn't get that right.
As we continue to mangle your name through self-doubt. Sorry. So the anecdote goes, right, that the game was going to be a war game, right, and he had all the miniatures all set up and ready to go. And I've heard this from Dave himself, so I'm fairly certain this is a true story. And we're going to do this little role play thing up front to set the stage, where you get to play these characters who are important to the setup of the big fight that's going to happen. And the big fight never happened, and all the miniatures just stayed on the shelf because everybody was just so digging on that. And so I could see that. I could imagine. This is pure conjecture, but I could imagine a lot of effort being put into writing these rules, was it Spells and Swords or Battle?
Swords and Spells, yeah.
Swords and Spells, thank you. To try and set up the situation where you could adjudicate this stuff, and then the players just sidestepping it, just being like, nah, we're going to do this other thing. I want to, nah, that's fine. Those armies can fight. We're going to go over here.
It's really legitimate. It's really, it's a really legitimate point, and I mean, clearly that is something I mean, we can point to some stuff that's been consistent in D&D all the way through 5th edition. That is clearly part of the game that has become vestigial and not really a core part of the promise of like a particular class or anything like that. And 5th edition might have, castles or something like that, but it's not really a promise that that's what you're going to be doing at high level. And maybe that was an oversight at the time of how strong, how addictive you're playing one character idea would be. They were still thinking about wargaming. They were still doing that a lot. You still had a charisma table that said you can have up to 12 followers, and having the game shift, right? Having the game shift from I'm running one person to I'm adjudicating a bureaucracy.
Yeah.
Not everybody's going to want to make that shift. Maybe very few people do.
I'm reminded very much of a sort of piece of advice I heard a lot in my video game work in the past, specifically on like online games that have a long lifespan. You get into that part of video game development that we call live ops, which is the game is out and it's running, and then you're continuing to add features, or you're continuing to develop the game, or just fix bugs or whatever, but while it's live and players are playing it. And it's online, so it's shifting and changing and whatnot. So anyway, one of the pieces of advice I would hear senior designers spout to junior designers often is, it doesn't matter how you designed it, it matters how the players are playing it. Right? Sort of once it's out there in front of players, they're going to find the fun. It might not be the fun you thought existed. And it doesn't matter. They're right. They're the players. They're right.
It's really interesting because I think I was probably thinking about that issue maybe yesterday, Paul. Mm-hmm. And the interesting thing is, what if? Okay, so again, like my much shorter video game experience was at a place like Papyrus Racing, where the intent was a simulation. Right, the intent was to simulate some particular thing in the real world, and in that particular case, I might come back around and say, in a case where you're trying to simulate a historical thing, you might actually want to edit it if the gameplay has tangented off in a totally unrealistic direction. Then I feel it might be, in that case, it might be legitimate to tweak the game to bring it back towards the simulation. And I think that's what we would have probably done with the racing game. I bet that's probably what like a flight simulator game might do, possibly. So that's an interesting that I debate myself of, do I want to, if I want to simulate a particular type of play, is it legitimate for the designer to rein it back in? Do you think that would be legitimate in that case, Paul, or not even there?
I would say it depends on your monetization plan.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Right. So
okay.
You may be thinking back in the day of like Gold Masters and press to disc, and any changes you make after the fact aren't bringing in dollars. But when dollars are on the line, which is the case these days in video games, right? And so many video games are free to download, and then you're paying a recurring fee, or you're buying things in the game or whatever. You have some other monetization scheme. The point being, when dollars are on the line, it becomes very easy to argue, I don't care what the intent was. This is making money.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, there you have. So I mean, that's interesting. So there you have the classic wrestling match between the business consideration of gaming and the art consideration of gaming.
Yep.
And I'm so glad you chose to wear the jacket today, Paul, because that just really nails the look of that particular point, actually. And
it's all about the bottom line, baby.
No, the art is pure. Keep it pure.
You want a job next week, don't you? You want to keep the studio doors open?
Screw them. If they don't get it, screw them. They're not good enough for my art.
Oh goodness! Anyway, I'm curious. I'm curious how much that came into play, right? Like, what was the motivation for making swords and spells, right? Like, who was like, that's got to be the next thing, rather than some other supplement? right? Like I guess I always assume
one.
I always assume that there's some inner core of necessity that somebody was like, I was playing my game and I could not solve this problem, so I need to write this material.
Well, that's a really good point. That's a good point. Probably someone. So either that really did happen, or Gygax was just bothered in his head.
Could be.
Was just bothered and said that he knew there was this problem. He was aware. He was definitely aware of some of these scaling problems.
Yep.
So he knew it all along, and maybe at some point someone must have said, "I'm going to have my trolls charge into your elves," and he was like, I guess I'm making it up now, and wasn't happy with that, would be my guess.
Yeah.
It's a really good point. I mean, so that was still within 2 years, right? That was still within 2 years of the original publication of original D&D. So, boy, all of those supplements came out in just like 24 months.
That's really fascinating.
Maybe it hadn't gotten through his head
I would love to have been a fly on the wall during the development of those supplements. Like, I'm very curious how much those were demand-driven versus just, no, we need a line, right? We need a line. Our fledgling company needs a line. So what do we got that we can print? Print the thing.
Well, I'm so glad you brought that up, Paul, because you're in such good luck, and so are our viewers, because next week, April 18th, we're going to have the person who was the editor of all of those supplements to OD&D, except the first one, namely Mr. Tim Cask, will be on next week.
Excellent.
And
we'll put the question
I'm looking at my swords and spells right here, and if I flip forward to the forward, Tim Cask wrote the forward because he was the managing editor at that point. So we can ask. I'm pretty sure we can ask Mr. Cask that question next week, and I'm looking forward to that.
Great. Answers to that.
Now, maybe Tim doesn't have any opinions about that. Maybe Tim will just say, "Nah, everything was fine." Do you think that's?
I kind of doubt it. We'll have to see what he has to say.
Now, one thing. So the as you say in original D&D, there's a whole lot of references back to chainmails, and look back for this, look back for that. Like anything in our foundational texts, there's debate about whether that was real or not. And I've seen at least one original D&D player played with Gygax who claims that there was never anything from chainmail that ever got used in their D&D games, and that that whole thing was business marketing fluff that Gygax inserted in a D&D unnecessarily in order to sell more copies of chainmail.
Interesting.
Now, there are other people that point out like that can't literally be possibly the case, because there's a whole lot of things that you really do need from chainmail. For example, there's no turn sequence in original D&D. There's no initiative. There's no turn sequence. Mm-hmm. So you either have to make it up or you have to look back to chainmail. There's no missile ranges. How far does your longbow shoot? How far does your crossbow shoot? Not printed anywhere in original D&D. You got to go look back at chainmail. Man-to-man combat adjustments. If you start looking at fantasy stuff, the fact that heroes get multiple attacks wasn't written in original D&D. The fact that dwarves and elves can see in the dark, you got to look back at chainmail for that. Which units can go invisible, as someone said in the chat earlier, or hide in the woods. Right? Yep. That's all stuff that you only have back in chainmail. And now, I can see like a really old school player that has digested all of this stuff, and it's part of their mental DNA, and maybe they don't even know where that comes from anymore, right? I'm just like, we were playing D&D, Mm-hmm. But the truth is, there's a lot of that stuff that really isn't in the books and has to be recollected. Morale rules, right? Points back to there for that. So I think like when I first got chainmail myself, the main thing was figure out what the missile ranges were. Because that wasn't anywhere in original D&D. Where the heck is this?
Yeah. I mean, it's not surprising that you have folks of the time period buying D&D and not being able to make heads or tails of it if that much is missing from the books. Although it is pretty explicit about like get out your copy of chainmail, so it's not like right. It's not like that's hidden, right? Or is it?
Oh no! And anytime it references it, of course, it's all caps.
All
right?
caps.
So it's capital CHAIML. So it jumps out of the page at you. And it is, it's. I bet it's like in at least 10, 12 different places in the original D&D books. Yeah. Totally.
Very interesting.
Now, another interesting ambiguity is that you crack open your original D&D Volume 1, and at least out of the box, it says that your combat will be run by chainmail. You're going to look back at the matrices in chainmail to run your combat. And the class chart, right, is like, here's a fighter, here's your level, here's your experience, and here's what column to use in the chainmail matrix for their attacks. That's actually what it says. And then a couple pages later, it says, now here's an alternative that you might consider. The alternative combat system. You might use what's called a 20-sided die if you have one of those crazy things. And you might look at this different matrix where the attack rolls are gauged against a 20-sided die, if you want to do that. Now, again, the original Gygaxian players say that's what they always did. Yep. So I think if they debate that point, I think they're mostly talking about, were we running combat with a D20, or were we still using all D6s like chainmail would? So I think that might be the point that maybe Mr. Mornard was focused on.
Yeah. I mean, I can see the argument that, like, I'm sure that Gygax and everyone involved in developing D&D in those time period had the D20, and so of course they were like very happy with using it. And I'm sure someone at some point went like, wait a minute, a lot of our players aren't going to have the D20, right? So we need to make sure there's a method in there for them to play without it. But then I
bet that's a good point.
For whatever reason, then I would almost want to flip it. Then, like, why would you not start with the D20? It's like, here's the default system for combat, and you don't have a D20, you could go use chainmail instead.
In retrospect, that seems like, they should have just yanked out the chainmail combat matrix reference. That, according to everybody, that didn't really get used. The book says you got to have a 20-sided die on the second page in order to run D&D.
Okay.
So, why not run with that?
Yeah.
But yeah, it's interesting. Again, I mean, that highlights the fact that the other interesting thing about chainmail is it's all D6 based, right? Everything in the entire chainmail system is all D6, and then you made this transition to D&D where you started to use polyhedral dice. So that itself might have been one of the largest shifts from chainmail, man-to-man fantasy type stuff to D&D. Seems like a good idea. Seems like a solid idea that had legs to use polyhedral dice. That seemed to work pretty well, I guess.
Yeah. Certainly. Plenty of companies alive today because of that choice.
So I'm told. So I'm told.
So what else? So you're continuing to consult your copy of Chainmail when running the game, like when running OD&D. You have your Chainmail handy.
Well, okay. Now you're the one that gave me a bound copy.
Yes.
Of the original D&D books in one volume, which again is one of the best gifts I ever got. And you also made one for Mr. Tim Cask, actually, so we can ask whether that was useful for him as well. And you were wise enough in this bound volume to put chainmail in it as the first part of the sequence.
Now this is interesting, though. I think if we compare with Tim, that I can't remember if his copy has chainmail in it or not, because his copy certainly has all the supplements, and I think your copy does not.
Right. And correct. You put Greyhawk in here and not the other ones.
Yeah. A lot of those choices were made just for personal taste and for how big is the book going to be and how fat is it going to be and how many pages do I need to slam into it. Trying to remember whether or not Tim's copy has chainmail in it or not. Can't remember.
I think in the past you told me it doesn't.
Yeah, I think maybe it doesn't.
I think it might not. Yeah,
I think that might have been too much. Can't remember.
But for me, I really wanted that.
Yeah, you really wanted it.
Yeah, I really wanted it for initiative, missile combat, man-to-man modifiers, that fantasy reference table that John Miller just mentioned in the chat a minute or two ago. There's a lot of kind of buried gems there about how the fantasy types work and how man-to-man combat works that you would overlook. And it's one of those things whereby, when they bifurcated systems in the 80s between basic D&D and advanced D&D, that's where a lot of the differences came from. Is Gygax writing AD&D still had these memories of all the stuff back in Chainmail that he didn't bother to copy into OD&D, whereas the basic line just copied stuff from OD&D. And so the places where stuff was in chainmail but not OD&D, that stuff tended to still be in the advanced line and tended to be absent from the basic line, such as fighters getting, 8th level fighter getting 8 attacks. Big difference in those two lines. Dragons being able to see invisible stuff. Same difference, actually.
Interesting.
Yeah. So it's funny how there's many cases of that I've witnessed of Gygax having this kind of common game understanding in his head, all the way from chainmail through original through first edition, and not being super laser sharp about writing down every single one of those rules in each edition, even though mentally he thought it was all the same game.
Fascinating. I wonder, like, for the modern old school DM, how important do you think, if somebody's sitting down to play, I'm going to run OD&D, or I'm going to run OED, or I'm going to run Swords and Wizardry, or whatever, I'm going to run some flavor of original D&D. How important is them to have access to chainmail and be consulting it like that, versus rather the other way I would think of doing it is to just pull forward, right? To look forward and say, I'm going to look at AD&D, or I'm going to look at Basic, and I'm going to pull stuff from that back into my OD&D game.
I can't believe anybody be so crass as that. Are you kidding me? What? No, I mean, Philistines! Philistines, how dare you? Obviously, that's what most people are going to be doing.
Right.
I understand that I'm an outlier who...
So that's my question.
As the person Gygax points to and calls a huge nerd on Twitter, right? So I understand that I'm doing this a little bit more in depth than a lot of people, and of course, people should have their own understanding and should really not be doing much book lookups while they're running the game, right? I mean, honestly, that's something I'm doing during design work, in prep for a game. No, I don't literally crack chainmail open. When I'm actually running OD&D, I don't want to crack any book open while I'm actually running the game.
Right. It's interesting. I don't know. I've never really dived really deep into the chainmail rules, to be honest, because I never sat down and was like, I'm going to play these as is, because there's plenty of other fantasy or medieval war games that I think are probably better. And then in terms of like it affecting my D&D game, I'm more likely to do the inverse of what I just said, of like look forward and say like, well, really, and this is just maybe just our personal preference here, Dan, because for a long time I was playing BX and then reaching back into OD&D where there was stuff that I wanted, and you were running OD&D and possibly reaching forward, or maybe not. Maybe you were trying to reinterpret from as original source as possible. But I remember there was a period of time there where we're both running our own campaigns and talking to each other a lot, and that's a good idea, and slowly our games were starting to converge into this system that is I don't know what.
It's pretty, at least pretty similar. There's a lot of what you and I call OED is, I write it, but a lot of the time I do ask you about like what would you want to do in this situation to try to match sensibilities, and of course you have a very strong design sense for RPGs. And look, my first gaming was in Basic, right? Yeah. So Holmes Basic, and then is what I had, and then I ran for many years. I ran with the Moldvay BX system, and it's a great system. And anytime I crack open BX, right, I'm always really impressed over and over again by the really sharp design sensibility that Tom Moldvay had there, with just one or two, unfortunately, large missteps, I feel. But frankly, up until 1984, most of my D&D was in Moldvay BX. Yep. So a lot of my sensibility comes from the same place. And if I could wave a magic wand and make anything happen at all, I mean, no offense to Tim, but if we could have had Moldvay editing Gygax in advanced D&D, that would have been a crackerjack product.
Yeah, you think that would have been?
That would have been amazing.
Yeah.
If assuming Tom was empowered to actually make changes, which would be a very
Right.
different alternate world than the one
Right.
we were in.
Quite possibly, he was able to do with Basic what he was able to do because the Eye of Sauron was not upon him, right?
Exactly.
But
yep.
let me get back to the question I was trying to drive at, which is specifically this: as the person at the table who then has taken the more academic approach of like really digging into chainmail and trying to incorporate the rules forward, are there any gems in there? Are there anything in there where you're like, if you're pulling from AD&D or BX, you're missing this?
I think for me, a lot of it's understanding what the original motivation was, right? So if I want to edit something, I've frequently found, I'm like, this is just a mysterious, weirdo, gonzo rule. What could have possibly been in their heads? And if I look at it one edition prior, suddenly that mystery gets cleared up. And so knowing the original motivation for it has solved a bunch of problems. I'll pick out one thing just to be concrete about that. And so, okay, parenthetical. John's asking, what is my main gripe with BX? It's racist class. But obviously that didn't exist prior to Moldvay's BX. That's actually the one thing that I crack it open. Also, the ability scores that you can't increase reasonably past 18 is a problem for me
because of the bell curve on bonuses. On modifiers?
Correct. Yeah, but I would say because of the shrinking range. So it's 3 pips for a +1. It's 2 pips for a +2. You only get +3 for 18. Then if it goes past 18, what do you do there?
Right.
And
right. Yep.
Frank Mentzer has an answer to that in his Immortal sets, and it's Looney Tunes. It's Looney Tunes. So if Tom had a fixed range, like they do in 5th edition, right? Fixed range, then you can expand it smoothly to higher numbers, and everything works out right.
Right.
That's basically it. That's pretty much basically it. Just those two things.
Okay.
They're kind of big things.
I thought we were going to talk about turn sequence stuff. That's always the thing I think that grabs my eye in terms of stuff that looks like it came out of Chainmail or OD&D and migrated all the way into BX is that weird turn sequence.
Well, that's a good point, right? And so the fact that OD&D didn't say anything at all about turn sequence made this kind of hazy gap. And so as we know, the initiative and the turn sequence changed a lot over the years. Changed a lot between BX and 1st edition, 3rd edition, 5th edition. It's very different, and they didn't quite nail that in original D&D. And so you're right, the war game style sequence. I mean, maybe you want to pull up that page. I don't know if that's useful.
Yeah.
So that's that was at page 9. If Paul's looking at a whole lot of text, I sent him a bunch of images there. That's all text.
Is that the one?
So it's not that. No, it's not that. It's going to be an all-text page that has...
There it is.
Yeah, there you go. So here's the turn sequence out of Chainmail for mass combat. There's no revision to this in any other edition. It's not revised in the man-to-man rules, the fantasy rules. There's nothing in OD&D. And of course, you can see right off the bat, well, there's 2. Right off the bat, there's not one turn sequence. There's actually 2, right?
Yep.
At the top of the page, there's the move counter move system, and then at the bottom of the page, there's the simultaneous movement system. And the basic difference is the one on the bottom, you got to write down your orders on paper first.
Right. This seems like the sort of thing that probably folks who were in the scene at the time debated hotly. I feel like probably there were 2 camps about how the right way to run your turn sequence in any war game was, and I feel like this is probably a nod to okay, well, it's not that important to this game. Use whichever one you like. That's fine.
Well, I'm glad to report that debate has been finally settled.
Has it?
And if you ask about this on modern war game or OD&D boards, everyone it's still a huge point of contention. Yeah. It's still a huge point of contention about written orders or not.
Yep.
And maybe our viewers want to chime in about which one they prefer. But your point, Paul, of course, was looking at this is that this sequence of steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 is very similar to the sequence of steps that you see in Tom Mulvey's BX game.
Yeah.
Not exactly the same. And of course, the main difference is that in chainmail rules, every phase happens for both players. So player A and B does step 1. Player A and B does step 2.
Right.
Whereas in Mulvey's BX, it's player A does step 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5, and then player B does those. Or like a team, I guess I should say team A does those.
Yeah,
and
yeah, I was
team
going to
B
say,
does those.
it's team-based, right? Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So, and is that something you actually you follow through, or I think you expressed some surprise?
I feel like was
recently?
it just last week were we talking about this, or maybe it was in the post-show chat in Discord? But I feel like it came up about like who actually uses this, and then there was even debate then. Amongst our patrons about whether or not that was a good way to run combat or not.
And I think we're having the debate happen again. I think I'm seeing the debate.
Yeah.
So we just restarted it all over again.
Rekindle it. Sorry, everyone.
I'm going to pull up. Pardon me, I'm going to pull up my Mulvey here, and I'm going to. Okay, so every time this happens, at some point, we were all going to be on the same page. Okay, it says the side that wins the initiative acts first and does 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then C, the side with the next highest initiative, does 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Right. Mm-hmm. So each side, each team is supposed to go through the 5 phases, which is basically the same order you see there in Chainmail. And it's funny because not even First Edition has that same thing. First Edition has a list of things you might want to do, but it doesn't try to chop them up into phases. So this is a point where Moldvay is actually a little bit more fiddly than even First Edition. So I guess that I would also kind of critique that.
Yeah, that's the one that jumps out as to me when I'm reading Moldvay is like, what is this? What is this strange? How did this get in here? How did they not refine this one?
Good point.
Yeah.
You know, there's a document called the Perrin Conventions. Early, D&D, we all agree it has some ambiguity about how the turn sequence and how the combat's supposed to run. So Jeff Perren, the co-author of Chainmail, and in fact the guy who, according to the reports, has really started the kernel of the system, wrote a document clarifying the D&D system under the Perrin Conventions, and I read that a couple of years ago, and it is way more complicated than any D&D I've ever seen run. It's like I don't know, 20 phase on 2 pages or something like that.
Oh dear.
And so his sensibility, right, was definitely the wargamey type stuff like this.
Yeah.
So when the first time I ever heard of the Perrin Conventions, I thought, great, I'm going to clear up the D&D combat system, and now we're all going to have a nice clean system. And it's like way more complicated than anything I would ever want to try to run.
Oh dear.
Maybe if you're a RuneQuest fan or something like that, you want to look at the Perrin Conventions.
So what else did you want to touch on, Dan, about Chainmail? As we're getting close, we're in the last 10 minutes here or so.
Okay. So I mentioned that for me, it clarifies the motivation. A lot of it clarifies the motivation or the original germ of a lot of ideas about how do elves and dwarves work, and how do ghouls work, and how do giants and dragons work. And probably the top issue that I would pick out is how do fireballs work. I mean, so even today in 5th edition, we see the 5th edition designers saying, when we were designing the whole spell system of 5th edition, we really wanted Fireball to still be your best choice for the 3rd level spells, because it's been a common touchstone in every single edition from D&D from the beginning.
Wow.
Well, why Fireball? Why is Fireball gotten so much mind share? And the answer is that in Chainmail, your wizards had 2 abilities that they could use every round on an unlimited fashion, and they're to throw a fireball or a lightning bolt. Everything else they were limited with, but fireballs and lightning bolts they could throw every round without limit. How did it work? Use the catapult rules.
Right. Or isn't the lightning bolt like the cannon rules?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. So the fireball just says use the catapult rules, and the lightning bolt just says use the cannon rules, which of course shoots in a straight line and knocks a whole bunch of people over.
Yep.
And a lot of people say fireball's overbalanced, right? Fireball's too powerful. Well, the thing that balances, and Fireball can kill a whole bunch of people, right? It's got a big radius, and actually in Chainmail, automatic death. There's no damage, there's no save, just plop it down. Anybody under the circle, they're just dead, just taken off the board in the story. So what's the balancing factor? And the balancing factor is on the table, right? Not theater of the mind, on the table with the miniatures, the player had to verbally call the distance without measuring it.
Yep.
And so the balancing factor was entirely how skilled was the player at estimating the distance. And if you misestimated it, and presumably at a longer range, harder to estimate, then you just miss, and you wouldn't hit your target at all. And that same exact language is still copied forward into original D&D and first edition and second edition. It still said, technically, it still says all the way up into second edition, the caster has to call the distance. Unlike any other spell. And it kind of frankly doesn't make sense when you're running Theater of the Mind without miniatures, but it does make sense in Chainmail. So to me, I look back and go, oh, that was the balancing factor. There was supposed to be a balancing factor in it. What can I do to recreate that? And honestly, Paul, I've bungled that in the past. And you know that I have a rule that I've used for a number of years in D&D, and I need to modify that. Because in retrospect, that was not actually a great adjustment.
You're talking about the randomly adding a die roll there to fudge the landing point.
And what I realized was that die roll is what happens for catapults at long range. And so that might be something that's halfway reasonable at very, very long distance. But up close, I should have been doing something different. The problem is, in Chainmail, catapults can't shoot at short range.
Right.
So the rules only handle stuff at long distance, and it overlooks the short range.
Interesting.
And me finally noticing that in Chainmail is going to allow me to come up with I think a better house rule for that.
Wouldn't that be fascinating if there was a minimum range of some spells?
Are there any? I feel like
I don't know. Minimum, like a minimum range? I don't think so.
Probably not. Yeah, probably not. Probably not. Good point.
Only in terms of like you don't want to be caught in your own fireball, right? Like
exactly. Precisely.
Yeah.
Precisely. Good point. Good point. Yep.
Very interesting.
So that's one of those shifts, right? Original rule for catapults made sense at long range. You shift and say it can be any range, and all of a sudden you have a little bit of a gap of handling that, which I have only actually noticed myself fairly recently. Oops.
I think it would be a disservice if we didn't talk a little bit in this show, Dan, about Book of War. I know probably our viewers know all about it, but for those who don't, Dan wrote his own set of rules for mass combat that coincides with D&D, or that can mesh with D&D, called Book of War. Definitely recommend you check that out. Where are they going to find that, Dan?
It's on oedgames.com. Look for it on oedgames.com, along with the Book of Spells product. Thank you for pointing that out, Paul. And and probably our viewers also know that my partner Isabel and I commonly do a show where we actually play Book of War live Saturday nights usually. So hopefully we'll have another show next Saturday for that. And we have a lot of fun with it. And the interesting thing is I've been seeing people discover that on social media and not even know about the show. And just yesterday, someone posted on Twitter, I just got Dan's Book of War product and played it for the first time, and we had an awful lot of fun, but I think that we mangled up a whole lot of rules. And my response was, well, every time we run it, we mangle up a whole bunch of rules too. So that's perfectly fine.
Yeah.
And we try to get better.
Grand tradition of screwing up the rules.
And
that's... Yeah, and I can certainly attest that it does synergize well with old school D&D. We've run multiple old school D&D campaigns where we've included it and used it to resolve large scale combats that the players get entangled in, and it works very well.
That was the intent, and part of me wants to love swords and spells, but it doesn't work very well. Part of me really wants to love battle system. And the mechanics there are a little bit wonky too. And with Book of War, you're back at the intent of Chainmail is back. You just roll a giant wad of dice and you just count up how many came up, 5 or 6 or whatever, and you can immediately visually see the results. And there's no paperwork. There's no record keeping like battle system or Swords and Spells needs. Is you get some kills, you take the figures off the table. That's basically it. So it finally, that was on my mind for 20 plus years, and it's finally scratched the itch. And I am very grateful for the really nice feedback that I get from a lot of people saying that likewise that it kind of scratched their itch. Now, I also got to point out
love from the chat.
Oh.
Excellent.
Thank you so much, John. That's awesome. That's amazing. It's kind of frightening.
Excellent.
I will say, now the next thing that people want to do is, since it's at 1 to 10 scale, generally, if you do want your hero or wizard to show up, they have to be 10th level. So the little bit of a remaining gap that a couple of different people have wanted to address is, well, what happens if I want like kind of a fast-paced game like this, but for like a 4th or 5th or 6th level character? And a couple of people have suggested a couple of things. You in particular, Paul, drafted a set of rules called Odd Encounters. I think that's how you pronounce it.
Yeah, that's it was meant to be a play on OD&D because it's odd.
Right.
That was a very that set of rules, and I realized I never even posted it to my own blog with any fanfare or anything, because it was a very self-serving thing that I put together based on Book of War and then just D&D and whatever I could mishmash together. Specifically in the situation where the place I was working had a lot of people who were very interested in war games but just didn't have the time for it. And we had things where we would try after work gatherings where we maybe play Warhammer, and they just weren't flying. It was too complicated. It was too, it was difficult for newbies to get into, and it consumed too much time. And so we had a bunch of miniatures and terrain lying around, and we wanted some game where we could just kind of casually play. So I was specifically looking for a thing that we could set up in a corner of the office, and people could go and take their turns, like having like a chessboard there where you're not really synchronously playing, where you could just be like, oh, whose turn is it? So and so's turn. Okay, go over and move your guys, and so you could play a war game like thing over the course of many days or many weeks, and kind of scratch that itch. So that's what it was built for, and it's just a little skirmish game. So I don't know how well it holds up. I don't know. It wasn't extensively play tested or anything like that. So,
but it scratches an itch, and I think it's a very good stab at that. I actually do have that on my blog. So if you go to my blog, Delta's D&D, you can look up Paul's Odd Encounters. And you know what? I have the whole core rules to Book of War on there as well. So if you just search my blog for Book of War, you're going to see the core rules, and you can see what it looks like and whether it would be something that you'd like to try. We just take some miniatures and some D6s, basically.
Excellent.
Yeah. Thanks for bringing that up, Paul, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, I should probably post that to my blog since I never did. I don't know why I never posted about it. It was not a thing that I was really making for wide distribution. It was,
I'll plan to put a link in the YouTube archive to this video, actually, but it is on my blog, Delta's D&D.
Great.
Under the title Odd Encounters, so I'll put a link there.
Great. Yeah. Good stuff. All right, Dan. Any final thoughts on Chainmail?
Well, I'm glad it got published. I'm glad they took the risk at the time of sticking some peanut butter in their chocolate to put the idea of fantasy elements like hobbits and dragons and trolls and ghouls and balrogs and ents and Nazgul, as they had it in the first edition. I'll point out is my last stab, and it really was the germ. That wasn't their initial instinct that was going to be the product that made them famous, but the idea of let's kind of break the mold and put some fantasy stuff in it was really what was the platform for our fantasy role playing in our D&D games. So I like to go and see what was on their mind in the earliest state, and for me that clears up some stuff. And I love having my copy of Chainmail available. Awesome. I would recommend it. Anybody watching this show, you are someone that likes or are interested in the history of D&D enough. You should go get Chainmail on DriveThruRPG.
Yep.
And see what it looks like.
I did place a link to that in the show notes already, so that's in there. If you want to go find the PDF of Chainmail, you can still get it.
Definitely.
Excellent. Viewers, if you want to see these links, you can just check out the description here in our YouTube video. Likewise, leave us some comments. Tell us what you think. What have you used for massive combat in your D&D games? Or have you played Chainmail all on its own, and do you think it stands up? Yeah, let us know what you think.
Yeah, I'd like to see that. Like, and have you played the Chainmail Mass Combat game? Have you played the Chainmail Fantasy Supplement one-on-one game? I'd be interested in hearing a mix of which of those things do you play with. Do you mostly just use it for the jousting rules, which we didn't get into? That'll be another episode. Of course, if you happen to be new to the show, remember that we are on social media like Twitter and Twitch and Facebook and YouTube and GitHub. And we do have the handle Wandering DMs on all of those sites. So if you could like, follow, subscribe to us on those sites, we'd really appreciate it.
We definitely would. And if you prefer to listen to our show in audio-only podcast format, you can get it from our website at wanderingdms.com or various podcast carriers such as Google Podcast, iTunes, Spotify. If you are using one of those third-party carriers to listen to our show, please take a moment to rate and review us there. That helps other users of that platform find us, and really appreciate it.
We definitely do. Look for things coming up this week on the Wandering DMs channel. Hopefully, Paul will have a show on Thursday for 10 Dead Rats. Hopefully, I will have a show Saturday night for Book of War. We will do our best. We'll try our best. And then, of course, as we mentioned next week, what a great segue this is. We did not plan this at all. But again, next week, April 18th, we will have Mr. Tim Cask on. And, of course, Tim was the original editor of the Dragon magazine, and he was the editor of all the original D&D supplements save Greyhawk. So he is, I believe he's the only person on Earth that attempted to both wrangle Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson's writing into shape at different points. So, personally, I am really looking forward to... and if you want a little preview, Tim is still active, does games at conventions, last I heard, has his Curmudgeon in the Cellar videos on YouTube you can look up. And I'm really looking forward to asking Tim about his experiences editing early D&D stuff next week.
Yeah.
I think we both are.
Yeah, should be a good time.
And of course, and Paul knows him pretty well, frankly, so we'll hopefully get some extra insights that way. And of course, big shout out to our patrons who support us in our show and getting great guests like Janelle Jaquays last week and Tim Cass next week. If you're in a place where you could possibly join our patrons, please do go to patreon.com/wanderingdams, and you'll see our different tier levels that include offers like access to a private Discord server where we have lots of conversations going on all the time, and discounts on merch, and there's a post conversation that happens live after the show on Discord, and so many. And polls and surveys on what we ought to have on upcoming shows and blogs.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
Man,
and access to certain patron-exclusive videos, such as your breakfast briefings with re-invited guest Isabel Garbani. Right.
Paul, we got to offer less stuff. We're offering too much stuff on the patronage. I mean, I don't regret that, but it's just like, so many things. And we're adding more things all the time.
Yeah, I'm sure we will be over there very soon on the Discord to have our regular post-show chat where I'm sure we'll be discussing all manner of things around Chainmail, and I won't be surprised if we talk a little bit about fireballs. So come join us. Come join us after the show and have a little chat. It's really fun.
It's really nice, actually. We're having more people in that conversation every week, and actually, it's becoming many of our favorite part of the week, actually. Yeah. So Paul and I will go and do that momentarily, and of course, don't forget that we are live every Sunday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time next week with Mr. Tim Cask. So we do hope that you'll come back and join us again next week for another thought-provoking discussion.
We'll see you then.